Now, this is a new annual lecture series which will focus on the big issues and will shine a light on cutting-edge thinking and new research by harnessing all the big brains, the experience and the specialist expertise in rooms like this. And we want us all to get ahead of the curve and deliver a real step change in the outcomes for children and young people. Now, before I introduce our esteemed keynote speaker, Professor Gordon Harrell, who I know you've all come to listen to, I want to just briefly set out, if I may, the scene and explain why we've chosen mental health and adverse childhood experiences as the topic for our first in the lecture series. And there are three aspects that I just want to briefly touch on. Firstly, I believe mental health is one of the major public health challenges facing our generation. In January 2017, not so long ago, the Prime Minister herself at the Charity Commission's event named it as a burning injustice. I couldn't agree more. Many of us here are familiar with the facts and the figures, but we shouldn't lose sight of just how shocking they actually are. 1 in 10 children between the age of 5 and 16 have a diagnosable mental health condition. That's roughly 3 in every classroom in the country. Research published last year shows of 14-year-old boys and girls, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 10 boys have symptoms of depression. A YouGov poll for Barnardo's earlier this year in January found almost half of children aged 12 to 16 feel sad or anxious at least once a week. The message is clear. This isn't a small problem. It is big and it affects a large number of children. Now, we often hear the number of children and young people with mental health needs is rising. We also know that amongst the complex reasons for this, there are growing concerns about the impact of technology too. It's clear that the internet brings fantastic opportunities for young people, but we also know it brings new dangers. I believe the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, was right to say he will crack down if online companies don't do more to prevent cyberbullying and limit screen time. But we also know far too many children don't get the right support at the right time when they need it. We know that 3 in 4 children, for example, with a diagnosable mental health condition don't get access to the support they need. On average, children in England can wait as long as 10 months for the start of treatment. Yes, 10 months. And as any parent will know, that is an incredibly long time in a young person's life. A few weeks ago, on a visit to one of our services, I met a 15-year-old girl called Izzy in one of our services in the northeast of England. Now, Izzy had tried to commit suicide more than once. She told me that her Barnardo support worker had been, in her words, the difference between life and death. The worker had given Izzy her phone number and said that she could call her any time during the day or night. Izzy said having that support had given her the strength to pull through. And you know, she had never needed to call our project worker in the middle of the night. It was the fact that she knew somebody would be there just for her that made all the difference. But not all young people make it. On the wall of that same service was a picture of another teenage girl who had taken her own life the year before. So that's why we need to talk about children's mental health. That's why I say, with great consideration, that we are sleepwalking into a mental health crisis in this country. Secondly, we need to understand what's so important about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Now, as you know, Barnardo supports some of the most vulnerable children and young people in the United Kingdom. Most of these children have already suffered ACEs or trauma by the time they come to our services, or they are at risk. Many children in the care system and care leavers have experienced neglect, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, domestic abuse, family breakdown, or more likely a combination of several of these factors and more. We also know that children who have experienced trauma are far more vulnerable to being groomed and sexually exploited. The same goes for gangs, drugs, becoming involved in criminal exploitation, ending up in youth offending institutions, some of the issues addressed in the government's new serious violence strategy. We recently looked at data from young people at a drugs and alcohol service that we run in Scotland. Out of 37 young people aged 14 to 26, 30 had 4 or more ACEs, and 13 had 7 or more, as well as their addiction. But addiction was the only diagnosis that they had been given. But there is a really important caveat here. Children who have difficult childhoods do not automatically have poor outcomes later on. With the right support, often from that one adult who really believes in them, like the Izzy example, we know that young people can go on to achieve incredible things, to live full, happy adult lives, but they've got to get the support. That's why addressing ACEs and promoting well-being is a thread that runs through all of our work. We help parents form secure attachments with their young children. We deliver social and emotional learning programs for children in schools. We provide specialist support to children in care, caregivers, and young people who've experienced sexual abuse and exploitation, and to those at risk. And our mental health services include counseling, therapeutic support, and help to recover from bereavement. Now, for more than 150 years, Barnardo's has believed in all children, whatever their history or the challenges they face. And back in 1866, when Dr. Barnardo first offered shelter and education to the children of East London, he didn't use the language of ACEs. The words have changed, and our understanding has evolved, but our mission to bring hope and love to children who need it most always stays the same. So finally, you might ask, what do we do next about all this? Well, I'm sure you'll all agree this isn't a problem that any one individual, charity, agency, or government department can ever solve on their own. Working together, we need to take urgent action to help children with mental health problems today and identify children at risk of developing them tomorrow. There is, of course, a strong moral reason to act, but there's also an equally strong cost efficiency case. The earlier children get the support they need, the more likely they are to overcome the challenges they have faced and go on to have a positive future. One could argue the investor-save case quite easily, I think. So there is a really important role here for government. The recent Green Paper, Transforming Mental Health, could be hugely significant. It sets out some really good proposals, I think, for therapeutic provision in schools, for school leadership on mental health, and for reducing waiting times. These are absolutely the right things to do, and we want to work closely with the government to help make it happen. But I think the government has a unique opportunity to go much, much further. It could use the Green Paper to drive transformational change and give children across England the access to the help they need it when the access they need when they need it. However, the current proposals don't go far enough. Even if it all goes to plan, under the existing proposals, children and young people in 3/4 of England would see no improvement in 5 years' time. That just isn't good enough. You may have seen that the House of Commons Education and Health and Social Care Committees published their joint report on the Green Paper just this morning and expressed very similar concerns, saying that the plans are unambitious and will leave hundreds of thousands of children and young people without proper care. So I really hope the government takes this rare opportunity and finds the resources and the timeframes to match up to the rhetoric. If they do, the results could be phenomenal. So my hope, colleagues, and one I'm sure you all share, is that the next generation will have better mental health than the generation who came before. Nothing less is acceptable. So I'm going to stop now and hand over to our fantastic keynote speaker. I'm absolutely delighted that Professor Gordon Harrell has agreed to deliver the inaugural annual Barnardo's lecture. He's Professor in Child and Adolescent Mental Health in the School of Psychology at the University of Sussex, and literally the leading expert on adverse childhood experiences in the UK. And amongst his many accolades, he's a member of the Economic and Social Research Council, a special advisor to the Early Intervention Foundation, and a regular consultant and advisor to government departments in the UK and abroad. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Gordon Harrell.
Good evening. It's a genuine pleasure to speak to you this evening. having almost not made the time of the building. I walked the wrong direction when I came out of the train station. It is a particular pleasure, and I'll say this, people won't know this particular fact about me, but I attended the same school as Thomas Barnardo. I'm a past pupil of St. Patrick's Cathedral Grammar School, or St. Patrick's Cathedral Choir School, as it was in Thomas Barnardo's day in Dublin. And it was while at the school, Thomas Barnardo formed his interests in protecting children, not necessarily because of his time at the school, but while he was a pupil at the school, having named the school and a past pupil. And I was an 11-year-old and was taken for a walk up from St. Patrick's Cathedral Grammar School up Dame Street to Trinity College by two teachers, Mr. Swarbrick and Mr. Bateman. They may be watching YouTube today, who knows. And we walked past Barnardo's School for Boys, or Barnardo's Boys' School, as it was named. And I was told the story of Thomas Barnardo. And it would be fair to say, if I was to date my interests in terms of mental health, youth mental health, and working with disadvantaged children, or all children, it was that conversation. So it's very important to link the history, if you like, in terms of working with, targeting, emphasizing, highlighting the need to assist young children. Young children are tomorrow's generation of parents, tomorrow's generation of adults, tomorrow's generation of parents. What's interesting about the adverse child experience literature is we've known for an awfully long time that adverse child experiences, as listed in the 10 primary adverse type events, put children's future lives at risk. What is very different when I say at risk in terms of poor outcomes, mental health, and intergenerational transmission. What is novel, in my view, and I'll try to make this point as I progress through this brief presentation, is that actually people are listening to how we address the causes of those particular events, or the role those particular events, I should say, serve as causes when it comes to poor mental health outcomes. So I want to focus in terms of my presentation on positioning the evidence around adverse childhood experiences and how we have opportunity, if you like, to, as Javed said at the outset, to quite genuinely influence the lives of a present generation of children. But actually, if we're being serious about prevention and early intervention, it's about promoting the lives of the next generation of children by promoting the interests of today's children, tomorrow's parents. And if you're serious about intervention and serious about policy targets, that's the time scale we're looking at. Multiple reports over the last several decades, if you like, State of the Nation reports in the UK, have identified that the state of UK children, school age, 5 plus, younger, in terms of mental health, is not good. A report several years ago positioned the welfare and well-being of UK youth, again school age 5 to 18, as the worst amongst countries in among OECD countries. To put the mental health landscape, if you like, in some degree of perspective, what do we mean by poor mental health? First thing to say is, when we talk about mental health, we mean doing well. Poor mental health is not doing well. In order to understand poor mental health, we have to understand mental health. In order to understand atypical development, we have to understand typical development. And I would put a question to the room. How many professionals in this room, other than psychologists or specific medically trained colleagues, have been trained in typical development and yet are working at the front line in trying to understand, assist atypical development? So my first recommendation, which won't have a particular order to them, is that actually when it comes to training, training really starts in the undergraduate classroom, whatever your professional interests are, in order to understand typical development. That will then allow you to be in a position to identify when atypical development is likely to occur, why, and what we can do about it. And my core message is, frontline practice is the essential next step if we are going to address this tsunami of mental health challenge across the UK, and more directly, the causes of those mental health problems that can be addressed and treated. Mental health problems. I'll use by way of evidence from age 2.5 to age 18. Yes, we see difficulties in younger children and indeed in older young adults, but I'll just use 2.5 to age 18, but I'm not being exclusive to those age groups. What types of problems do we see children and young people? Anxiety, depression, aggression, conduct problems, neurodevelopmental disorder, ADHD, autism, etc. Social competence, relating well to other people, peers, families, teachers, etc. Academic attainment, achieving well in school, doing well in school, behaving well in school. And physical health. Lots of new evidence, newish evidence, highlighting the challenges that young people are experiencing in terms of physical health-related outcomes. Two really important points about the evidence. If you went back 20 years, even 10 years, certainly 20 years, a mental health problem for a young person or an adult was only a mental health problem if it attained levels of clinical significance. We know that young people, and indeed adults, can experience serious difficulties before problems attain levels of clinical significance. And I'm going to state the obvious here. If you're going to prevent a problem attaining levels of clinical significance, you have to identify it early. Second, we don't see problems in young people in nice, neat, isolated packages. You don't just see an anxious child or a depressed child or a conduct disorder child or young person. Anxiety tends to lead to depression, tends to lead to conduct problems, tends to lead to more challenged social competence capacity, poorer academic attainment, and increased physical health problems. So actually, in understanding mental health problems of young people, we no longer look at single, neat packages. We talk about cascading problems. Anxiety precedes depression, precedes aggression, etc. So actually, early symptoms might be the first window onto serious later problems downstream, and not recognizing mental health as operating as part of a concert actually precludes effective intervention. Second, mental health problems are costly. The numbers generated here are somewhat out of date, not entirely out of date. They also are estimated based on levels of clinical disorder. So if you take these numbers and think that, okay, if we went beyond clinical disorder, what would the cost be? Exponential. So yes, it's great that we're interested in mental health. It's great that government is interested in improving the state of young people's mental health. It's extremely costly if you don't, or we don't, I should say, as the people at the front line. Correlates, causes of poor mental health. As a researcher, I use the word correlates, sorry for the technical language, a little bit causes in inverted commas, but I want to try to position the ACE literature. As I said, we have known all, and certainly several substantive elements of the ACE list, the 10 denoted list of adverse experiences generate poor outcomes for children. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, the list goes on, emotional neglect, divorce, etc. It's very important to point out that those events are unlikely to occur in isolation or unlikely to be independent. It's also very important to recognize that there is substantive evidence behind each of those ACEs with respect to early signals in terms of later outcomes. Divorce. Divorce is associated with poor outcomes for children. A factor that appears to explain why some children do less well than others post-divorce is the levels of conflict between parents, adults, before, during, and after the divorce. So, if we're going to attempt to address the effects of divorce on children, policy just targeting marital status are likely to be ineffective. Programs targeting interparental discord are likely to be more effective. So really important, one, to harness the opportunity that the ACE agenda presents, but not to lose sight of the science and the research and the intervention evidence that sits beneath each of those ACEs with respect to early intervention. So as an example, I've listed an array of standout family influences on children. I was asked to write a report back in 2000 and 2001 where one of the reports from the OECD, a UNICEF report, suggested UK children among the worst in the OECD, and one area of reported particularly poor well-being was sense of family support. What do we mean by family support? So myself and two colleagues were asked to write a report. What family factors stand out when it comes to mental health? Genetics. I'm going to come back to that. Rearing environment, particular experiences children have. This is a list of several standout rearing environmental factors, all that can sit beneath any one of your ACE elements with respect to correlates of poor outcomes for children across all ages. Family stress. Poverty, well known. Economic pressure, not poverty. Households where adults are struggling to make ends meet on a day-to-day basis but don't meet poverty index is associated with poor outcomes for children. Parent mental health, substance misuse, associated with poor outcomes for children. Parenting behavior, classically, attachment, parenting style, emotional neglect, etc., associated with poor outcomes for children. Interparental discord, actually 10, 20, 30 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, interparental discord wouldn't be on this list. Domestic violence, domestic abuse would be, and divorce would be. Interparental conflict is a common denominator to both. We recognize that actually adverse behaviors between adults, this is not negating domestic violence or divorce as strong adverse influences on children, but actually when you look at the interparental dynamic from a silence to violence continuum, you harness the exposure aspects of the adult relationship with respect to poor outcomes for children. So it's very much a dimensional construct. Nonetheless, domestic violence in particular, recognized as potently harmful to children's well-being. Family transition and change, separation, divorce, etc. But actually children's transition to school, children's transition into secondary school, primary, secondary school, out of school. Adoptive context, children, post-legal order, becoming a family. Where there's a family transition, where there's an event, a denoted event, it's an elevated period, potentially, in terms of risk outcomes for children. So actually, targeting transition periods, working with adults, working with carers, working with professionals, might be a window whereby you pick up some of the substantive risk for young people. Peer relationships and bullying, again, is very important. We don't lose sight of well-established evidence bases with respect to poor outcomes for children. Bullying is a distinctly negative experience for children, young people, and adults, and has long-term chronic adversity outcomes if left unchecked. New environments. Javed mentioned the digital world. This is a new interest area of mine. The digital world is, without question, a new environment. I'll talk a little bit about the relative role of genes and environment in a second, but actually, if I'm working in a practice context and I'm looking at family adversity on child outcomes, I actually don't ask any questions about digital environment. I'm aware of it, but it's not part of any systematized approach to working with a young person. It's, without question, a hugely significant part of the environments that young people experience, positive and/or negative. Likewise, the outcomes are the array of, that clock is 5 minutes fast, there's a nervous breakdown there, sorry, I nearly, my own adverse experience. Similar to the point made around the indices of mental health, these family factors, and I'm not negating the kind of core 10 ACE events, but if you took any one of those events and sit beneath them, the particular kind of dimensional aspects of each of them, we also see that these factors tend not to occur in isolation relative to associations with child outcomes. So a well-known established, and again I'm on YouTube, so my PhD supervisor gets credit here as well, Rand Conger, I was trained in the United States at Iowa State University, developed a model in the mid-1980s where there was what's called the farm crisis, and it was expected that families would go through economic change, economic transition. And building on work from Glenn Elder, Children of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the Iowa State legislator was a bit forward-thinking and said, you know what, we'll try to work with the children of families whose families go through economic transition so as to help those children when they're adults. That's in the mid-1980s. Iowa Youth and Families Project. As part of that project, Rand Conger and colleagues developed what's called a family stress model. They show that economic stress, economic pressure, day-to-day challenge was associated with poor outcomes for children. Over the past 20-plus years, the type of outcomes that I've worked on in terms of looking at family stress influences on children and others. Early sleep problems directly associated with early brain development. Conduct problems, antisociality. Academic achievement. And at the top, depression. Anxiety, depression is the area that I've probably spent most of my time working on. Female depression, male depression, and the intergenerational transmission of depression. So the model I'm about to put up, several hundred publications are associated with each of these types of outcomes, not just from Rand Conger and his colleagues, but it generated a generation of researchers in this area. What these researchers show, that economic stress is indeed associated with children's emotional health, behavioral health, etc., but not directly. That actually economic stress may impact children indirectly by promoting an elevated rate of poor adult mental health. And while paternal depression and maternal depression might seem entirely appropriate now, today, in 1989, 1990, when this model was first developed, paternal anything in a family model was completely novel. So don't lose sight of just how forward-looking this theoretical model is. The researchers go on to say that actually elevated contextual stress, poor adult mental health, affects children indirectly via parenting. And I've made that parent-child neglect, it's actually parent-child stress. But parent-child neglect, emotional neglect, parent-child relationship and child outcome would harness several of the ACE events. Intervention studies really targeted that link, parent-child interaction and child outcome. The researchers went on to show this link. I happened to be in the right place at the right time. Look at the Irish, as they say, and my supervisor, Gordon, go off and have a little look at this literature. A guy called Frank Fincham and John Gritch is suggesting the interparental relationship, whether you're living together or not living together, seems to be associated with poor parenting, which in turn is associated with poor outcomes. And I had the good fortune of making that my career. I say I'm from Dublin. No one needs to ask me to go and study interparental conflict, poor parenting, and child outcome. I can tell you that story. But I can't tell you that story as well without evidence. This link is now well established. Interparental discord, conflict between adults that's frequent, intense, and poorly resolved, is associated with more elevated poor parenting practices, an array of more negative parenting practices, and child conduct problems in particular, but also multiple other child outcomes. This association, well established, and you'll see at the end, increasingly, intervention interest is the link between the interparental relationship, living together or not living together, as I'll show in a second, and couldn't have said even 4 or 5 years ago, whether you're genetically related to your child or not, the relationship between you and a spouse, partner, carer, with respect to parenting proficiency, which in turn affects child mental health, is now well established. That link, however, the parent-child neglect, think of the ACEs list, adult interaction with their child, be it physical, be it sexual, be it whatever particular dimension you want. That link, that red line, is suggestive of being causal. Adverse child experiences children have promote more negative outcomes in terms of children's long-term development, which then may set the stage for intergenerational transmission processes. Huge amount of evidence. Back in about 1999-2000, I was presenting a statistical model that essentially said that, but in a more complex way. And I was asked a question. And the question was, that's very interesting, Gordon. Harsh parenting practices associated with negative outcomes for children. How can you conclude that? The vast majority of studies in your field involve biologically related parents and their children. How do you know that association isn't explained by what's called common genes? Genes passed on from each or one biological parent to their child explains that association. I actually couldn't answer that question as a researcher, as a scientist at the time, other than to say possibly not, but probably not. We need evidence. It took 12 years of working with 2 quite unique study designs to address that. But this challenge has a substantive implication for understanding the sequelae, what places a child at risk for poor mental health outcomes, to move from mental health, typical development, to poor mental health, atypical development. And in a nutshell, as you'll see in a second, we have 2 study designs. A large-scale study in the United States involving children adopted at birth, very uniquely adopted at birth, no pre-placement trauma. And a UK study set up, myself, my colleague Anita Thapper and others, involving a sample of just over 1,000 children, where children had been conceived through in vitro fertilization. And without going into the technicalities, with an IVF-type design, you can identify whether a rearing parent is genetically related or not to the child, where adoption occurs at conception. Yeah? Fully related, dad's related, mum's related, neither parent related. So we have 2 study designs where children and rearing parents are not genetically related. If I can show associations between rearing experiences and child outcomes, and those associations are significant, common genes can't explain that association. Doesn't mean genetic factors aren't important. Shared genes cannot explain that association. And this slide summarizes about 15 years' worth of research. And this paper, to big up the Association of Child and Mental Health, Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, which Louise also has a paper sitting in there, sums up the evidence over 20 years that actually rearing experiences children are exposed to map on to poor outcomes for their development, specifically in the context of interparental, inter-adult, inter-carer relations and parent-child relationships, and not just mother-child relationships, father-child relationships. So actually thinking of families as systems is now back in vogue. But guess what? The associations between environmental factors within the context of family life associated with poor outcomes for children. We've known this for a long time, but now we can conclude those associations exist whether you're genetically related or not. Implications not just for biological mum and dad, adoptive mum and dad, step-parent mum and dad, and any other configuration of family. Your parenting and the environment you provide for your child matters. Complicated, yes. Gene-environment interaction. I'm several colleagues from King's here, so I'm putting this up. We are now in a position to look at the complexity between biology and environments, not just to show or explain or highlight when things go wrong, but actually how we can make things go better. We now know that environments work with specific biological factors and that children at genetic risk, in the context of nurtured environments, do distinctly better, not just distinctly worse. So working with the environment is our target. Environments, in terms of core influences on children, are what are called malleable. Intervention targets, thus specifying the right type of intervention early, delivered in the right way, might actually change individual trajectories. That's a very complicated statement. What am I saying? The right intervention, delivered in the right way, efficaciously, can lead to improved outcomes for children. So to go back to Javed's point, where a child experiences one or more ACEs, he or she is not inevitably going to experience poor outcomes. And I tell you what, if I had to stand up here and say they are inevitably going to experience poor outcomes, we might as well all go home. But our interventions are effective, and the science sits behind that statement, not just evidence from a given intervention. The science sits behind it. Very quick transition. I've got about 10 more minutes. Is that okay, Javed? I'm okay? Yeah. Moving the debate forward from evidence to intervention. So I want to make the case, if you like. I want to ask you, I want to suggest that the evidence around youth mental health, while there's a huge amount yet to be understood, is pretty robust. The Green Paper, other reports, children in the UK and internationally, but children in the UK are not doing well in terms of mental health prevalence rates. Now, people can put their hand up and say, well, things are actually not worse, it's just more rigorous and more precise identification early by more professionals. Or things may be worse. Either way, the prevalence rates are the prevalence rates. So forget the debate about whether they're worse or not worse. The prevalence rates are the prevalence rates, okay? And not addressing that issue completely misses the point. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So depending on which report you read, either 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 young people in the UK suffer serious mental health problems. In terms of the mental health focus, which I'm a huge advocate of and very pleased to see, and the targeting resources in terms of identifying mental health difficulties, etc., what are we identifying? The beginning of the intervention process, the beginning of the state of the problem, or the end, or at least midway in terms of the cascading logic? So a lot of money is going into assessing mental health challenges, mental health profiles, mental health problems. What about money going into assessing the correlates of those mental health problems with the same level of rigor and the same level of precision and the same level of standardized approach as is the case with mental health problems? And that's what I'm going to ask you to consider doing, not just because I ask it, because actually we've got evidence that it can be done and it can be done effectively. Building frontline competence and capacity. I'll make a point at the very end here. You actually don't need me or a person like me to go into a Barnardo's context or an NSPCC context or any other frontline context or a school. And unless I have a master's degree or a PhD, only I can do it. No. You need people like me to train frontline practitioners to do exactly that and equip those practitioners with the confidence, the capacity, and the resources to do it well. And that's what I will advocate. I'm going to acknowledge one person in the room, Liz Baker. So I've worked with Barnardo's maybe 3 years. Maybe it seems only like a week, Liz. It's probably several years. Before ACE, the term ACE was popular, before what I've just recommended is now becoming more and more accepted. And Liz came to me in Cardiff and said, we would like to work with you. We're particularly interested in early identification, rigorous, programmatic, standardized early identification of the adverse experiences children have and how they map onto poor mental health outcomes. And working with Barnardo's, myself, my colleague Ruth Sellers, and others have developed what's called the BCAWAC, the Barnardo's Child and Adolescent Welfare Assessment Checklist, which is nothing more sophisticated than it's using what's called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, standardized norms, but having measures around exposure elements, parenting, interparental relations, siblings, wider exposures, and a scoring convention that allows a practitioner to say, okay, accepting parenting, negative parenting, interparental discord, and the list goes on. Standardized instruments with norm scores to allow that practitioner to say this child is or is not above population norms. Exactly what you do with the SDQ. Therefore, if high on poor parenting, on higher interparental discord, what programs are being recommended? Do the programs align with the profile the child presents? Guess what? Not very often. Where's all the money? Intervention spend. How about identifying whether the child or the parent or the family actually merit that particular intervention with the right type of assessment early? Barnardo's have been doing it in Wales for several years, so well done, Liz, and well done, Barnardo's. UK, yes, calls around government response to the Green Paper. Again, it's going to sound like I'm bigging up all the people I work with. I'm putting these examples up by way of example in terms of these things can be done. UK response, UK government response, I should say, in terms of this evidence. The Department for Work and Pensions put out their Helping Workless Families initiative last April. I'm still working with the Department of Work and Pensions, and I want to say, and I want to commend the policy officials in Caxton House down the road for the rigor they've gone about in developing this program. This program targets adults experiencing inter-adult, interparental relationship discord, parenting challenges, maternal and paternal, adult mental health, with a focus on improving youth mental health. They're starting with the factors that are associated with poor youth mental health, with the objective of improving adult youth mental health with a view to intergenerational transmission processes, positive mental health, improved academic attainment, elevated employability. That's the model. And I would encourage you to go and look at this resource because it is thoroughly evidence-based. So the UK government, by way of this particular department, is indeed responding to the evidence and indeed, in my view, serves as a model of good practice for wider UK departments, government departments, to look at this if we are going to address mental health challenges among young people. Last but not least, and then I'm finished, recognising the link between poor mental health and early environmental influences, ACEs. That link is the absolute shift that is required if we're going to improve outcomes for children. Mental health is not an isolated box of problems. Trauma, adverse child experiences, disadvantage, exposure to stress is not an isolated box of problems. They are connected. And our evidence is robust. They are connected, whether you're genetically related or not related. That doesn't mean the genes you carry don't matter. They fundamentally matter. But the environments work with them. And if you're going to have anything that's malleable, you're targeting environmental processes. A cascade model. What factors, environmental factors, stand out in affecting youth mental health? Family, school, peer. Nothing is new there. The new digital world. Interfaces with families, schools, and peers. We know next to nothing about that relationship when it comes to informing our understanding of what affects young people. A cascade model. Think of any youth. Anxiety to depression, aggression, conduct problems, academic failure, criminality, substance misuse, suicidality, employability, future levels of domestic abuse, domestic violence, and relationship breakdown. We have longitudinal evidence to back that those linkages up. How long can you wait not to intervene? Not just in terms of intervening with the mental health problems, but to intervene by way of preventing intergenerational and generational problems from cascading. Early environmental adversity. If you want a strategy for UK government or any government to respond, it's a public health issue. Not just mental health. The exposure factors that are associated with poor mental health is a public health issue. And that requires a cross-government strategy. Easy to say. The evidence base is hugely robust. Early intervention with respect to source of problem improves outcomes for children, and you see intergenerational reduction of those problems. Longitudinal evidence backs that statement up. Moving from eminence to evidence, I thought carefully about putting this up here, but I'm putting it up. I attended a presentation several years ago, and it was suggested that only those who hold master's degrees should be in any position to offer interventions to families or parents. I disagree. Those who hold master's degrees or PhDs should be taking the stripes off, leaving at the door, and helping those at the front line to do exactly what's required in terms of working with disadvantaged, vulnerable children and young people. And that's a change we need. You don't need a PhD to introduce the SDQ or the O'Leary-Porter scale or the CRPBI, Children's Report of Parental Behaviour Inventory. You just need to be trained well, practiced, and confident, and it can be done. And if done well, it aligns thus with effective programme intervention, evaluation of that programme, and hopefully impacts of that programme. Sounds like not rocket science. Putting it into practice, however, is the opportunity that we have presently. What puts children's present and futures at risk? Fundamentally, we know what places children's futures at risk. And the ACE literature and ACE awareness raising helps hugely in concentrating minds around that. This set of links. Adverse child experiences equals adverse adult experiences equals adverse parental experiences equals adverse child experiences. And the cycle goes on. So see ACE and the ACE list and literature as actually a start of an intergenerational cycle, and then ask, can you afford not to do something about it? Not starting from scratch. The UK, through work with Barnardo's, through examples from government departments such as DWP, from the investment from the DFE in terms of schools, huge progress has been made. So rather than focus on criticizing where we are and what we're doing, let's look at how you can be joined up in a way that aligns against evidence, examples of good practice, and harnesses the professional bodies that are at the front line of working with challenged youth and their families. Thank you.
So this is the panel. Before we take some questions from the floor, I'd just like to kick off with one, if I may, and ask each of the panel just to comment briefly on that. A lot of the Barnardo's experience, working with children, teaches us that resilience is a key skill and attribute that we try and help young people to develop, to cope and recover. So I'd be really interested in your views on what role you think resilience can play, and do we know enough about it to understand what works? And if I come to Gordon last, but say start with Sarah and Laura.
Thank you very much, and thank you as well, Gordon. It was a brilliant lecture, and I think a very timely focus on ACEs. And I would agree that what's our reaction to children who are having adverse childhood experiences? It happens, it will happen, and I think the focus on resilience, which you point to that, is actually our route through this in many ways. Resilience is about things that you can learn. It's a set of skills that you can learn, and it's also about helping children and young people think about the assets around them, so they think in a holistic way about their lives. But it requires staff who understand, what child needs to some help around resilience. And I think the focus that Gordon made on training, again, is really timely and really critical in all of this. We have teachers who no longer learn about child development in their training, which is incredible. And I think it's great for us to think about resilience, and indeed I'm sure all of us do a lot of training about how in schools you can help have a whole schools approach and help build children's resilience and abilities to cope when in those bumps in the life's road. But we have to understand what are ACEs and how do I spot a child who needs help. B, what are the assets around that child that we can help them understand and make use of. How do we help children understand their own mental health as being something ordinary and normal, just like our physical health? And how do we enable staff? One of the things around adverse childhood experiences and what the evidence shows us is that just asking a child or young person or adult about themselves and enabling them to talk about those experiences or express them, because children might not be able to talk about them, they might be different ways of expression, is of itself very important and very helpful for that person. So there is a whole gamut of things that go behind resilience, and I think one of the key critical things is about training and is about building understanding and awareness. And I also think that that's where the voluntary sector and organisations like Barnardo's are completely critical, because it's never going to happen through a government programme. It just never is.
Thank you. So you'll get a chance to build on some of that, I'm sure, in a moment. Laura?
I think resilience is absolutely key. I think ACEs is only part of the story, and actually inquiring around children and young people's experience of ACEs can have unintended consequences, because while we are usually trying to work from a position of strength and look at a strengths-based approach, inquiring about ACEs is looking at things from a negative angle. So I think the flip side of that is that when we are looking at that routine inquiry around ACEs, if we are also simultaneously looking at what the support is round about the child, it begins to bring us back into that domain of what are the strengths around this particular child, and not just the child, but about the family. So I think we need to be really mindful with our work on resilience that we are not expecting a child to be more resilient in the face of experiencing adversity, that we don't place the responsibility on the child to actually be more resilient. We can teach skills for resilience to that child, but we need to look at the child in the context of the systems that they function within. So that's within the family. What is the family resilience? What is the community resilience? And what is the resilience in the systems round about? So using that ecological model, I think, is really important so that we don't start shifting blame to children and saying you're not resilient enough.
All right. Thank you. Gordon.
I'll try to be brief for the questions. I think, resilience is a fascinating area of research. It builds on the old risk and protective factors literature, and it was actually Sir Michael Rutcher who rebooted literature and understanding around the term resilience. Resilience is fundamentally, if you think of negatives, if a child is, to use a child example, is resilient to a certain outcome, that child is not expressing an expected outcome. So in the context of maltreatment, one might expect to express various problems. That child is not expressing those problems. That's deemed to be resilient, not necessarily protective. Resilience is a process. What allows that child not to express an expected risk outcome? And can that be replicated? Understanding resilience, hugely important. Where resilience becomes an excuse for inaction, then I think it's actually potentially dangerous. So the number of times I hear we need to promote resilience, we need to show that a child is evidencing now grit, i.e., if left unsupported, that child may do okay. That's an extremely dangerous avenue to go down. It's very important not to mix up intervention effects, which is strengths-based. Can we develop strengths, which may allow a child or adolescent not to express other expected risk outcomes, the cascade model, but not to lose sight of the fact that resilience without intervention is a distinctly fraught area.
Thank you. Well, I hope that stirred some of you to think about what you might want to ask the panel. We've got some roving mics which are going to be circulating. There's one. If you could show your hands, please. I'm going to try and take 3 questions in a go. And if you could introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and be as succinct as possible with your questions, please. So one just there next to you, and then second one here, third one there in the yellow.
Hello, I'm Dr. Eula Slimson. I'm the head of early years at the University of Northampton. Absolutely loved everything that's said, because I love the things about resilience and everything you've said about ACEs, but we forgot the early years. And I totally agree with you about not bashing government, but actually we have policies that are creating lots of the issues for our youngest children. So we have a sector with low paid, low qualifications, and children in daycare for very long hours, a 30-hour agenda where only if you're working you can get that, and that adds to stress in the family. So how do we lobby to have one Secretary of State who is responsible for joining up these dots? Because I'm afraid from my experience, which is now 40 years, we are creating a lot of the issues for our young people, and we not only have a tsunami, we have a tsunami following that and one following that, because we are not taking our responsibility to protect children properly, whatever their background.
Thank
I welcome
you.
your views.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's take this question here, please. Just wait for the mic.
You're not. My name is Reverend Paul Nicholson, and I founded the Cares 2000 Trust, which now looks after 3,000 cases of the very poorest people, only the very poorest people, when they can't pay the rent, their fines, their council tax. And they are, as you have said, under most dreadful financial stress. To prevent that stress, the government has to improve the benefit system. I'm also an advisor to the Institute of Brain Chemistry and Human Nutrition. And I know that their research shows that poor maternal nutrition, both before and during pregnancy, leads to much more severe risks of permanent developmental brain disorder. And that is internationally replicated research. So there is, in both cases, you can't feed a mother, a pregnant woman, on a food bank for 9 months. And the fact that low income and debt creates mental health problems, you've got 2 causes to mental health problems. Prevention is so much better. What would you advise the government to do about it?
Okay, thank you. And just here, please.
Thanks very much. Claire Tyler, House of Lords, fantastic lecture, thank you so much. Brings together 2 major interests of mine, which are family relationships, and particularly the impact of parental conflict on children and children's mental health. And I love the way you brought the 2 together. My question is, often when I talk to people involved in children's mental health, I get the impression they're not particularly confident, actually, at looking at some of these wider family issues, and particularly, say, the parental relationship issue, and sort of feel that that's outside of their expertise and knowledge, and perhaps even what they should be doing and looking at. And I just wondered how you felt we could get frontline practitioners to feel more confident and competent to actually look at the issues, you know, in the round, link them up in the way you've suggested, and to actually see that as a legitimate part of their children's mental health work.
Thank you. Let's pause there then. So we've got a question on early years and how do we get government join up in terms of the policy and legislative agenda. We've got a question about nutrition and poverty and what would the advice be to government to address that. And then parental relationships and what would be the advice to frontline practitioners. Gordon, would you like to start with the government join-up, given you advise government on a whole number of...
Yeah, can I try those questions in the reverse order?
You can, if you want
address,
to. You don't have to answer all of them.
I'll do my best to sort of have a cascade of answers. How about that? Barnardo, Tyler, I think your question is an extremely salient one. How do we get practitioners to work with adults with respect to questions around the inter-adult, inter-parental relationship? I'm regularly asked this question. The answer is to move the question away from just talking about the inter-adult, the couple relationship, to recognizing that the dynamic in a household influenced by family relationships maps onto mental health outcomes for children. And that actually the evidence where we're targeting just parenting type processes to child outcome shows unsustained effects in the long term. Where the link is made between everyday exchanges, everyday activities between couples, and also bearing in mind that it's not all negative. Conflict is normal. Measuring it in a way that suggests it's atypical is no different than talking about parenting. Parenting comes with challenges. At what point does it become atypical? Mental health, occasions where there's atypical expression, maybe typical, adolescence. At what point is it atypical? When you bring the assessment tools into a practitioner's vicinity and introduce the hows behind the objective, I would suggest my colleagues from Barnardo's and others, you are pushing at open doors. The comment that is given to me most frequently is, I wish I had these materials, these tools 30 years ago. Head of CAFCAS in Wales sat down and said 30 years ago she worked with a child who is now a parent with their child. So should it be done? Yes. Can it be done? Yes. How? You promote confidence and capacity. Not just you should do this and feel good about it. Here's how you do it. Here's what it maps onto in terms of outcomes. And here are the intervention programs that will help you with respect to your purpose and objective and remit of job. Confidence building. That's the only way I can answer that question. The questions around other challenges, for example, absolutely. I mean, in terms of one policy mapping on in terms of complement to another policy, I'm quite happy to say they rarely join up. My kind of impassioned plea really is to identify what is working. So if I was to have a recommendation to government, look across the various departments, what is working, evaluate it, show it's working, including cost-benefit type analyses, and then ask how what you're doing maps on to how it might work better, including teachers, early years, across the board. Logic and process and policy are not necessarily joined up, but you have to start somewhere, and I'm suggesting, certainly over the last few years, 2 years that I've been involved, there's a definite shift in the right direction. It's keeping that going across other areas. Nutrition, brain development, all hugely important. I mentioned very, very briefly. What assists functional maternal well-being, functional maternal relationship well-being maps on to positive outcomes again for children. The focus has to be borne in mind here. The child is the centerpiece. The child is the centerpiece in terms of the influences around that child. Pardon? Yeah. 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 So if you look at the Department for Work and Pensions program, it's very specifically targeting economic disadvantage. Very specifically. Okay. Yeah. Sarah, do you want to build on that last question and answer about the nutrition and brain development?
I think that's a hard one because I think it's true. And how you improve the nutrition of families and of mothers specifically. without benefits changing or without funding changing, I think we're in a very difficult cleft stick, and I don't think there are any easy answers at all. And we know that all sorts of problems drop out of benefit changes. You know, we see that cyclically again and again. I think all we can do is say it is true. I don't have any solutions, sadly. I would like to come back to the question around parents and about children and young people, mental health staff, not confident maybe of working with that parental relationship, because I think it's true. And what we do see in mental health services is a focus on parenting, and that this is the one area where even with parenting, there is, on randomised controlled trials, the best outcomes in terms of children with conduct disorder, ADHD. That has the best impact and best effect. And yet, it is one of the most difficult things to actually deliver because parents don't turn up. And I think it's about the style. It's something about the style of service. And parents, when asked about why they're not coming, there is a whole sense of feeling patronised, feeling they're being told they're no good. As parents, that's how they feel. So it's they feel that they're being told. So picking up on building the confidence of staff to work with that family relationship, I think there is something about the way we approach this, the way we approach parents, the way we involve them, the way the training is delivered or described when we're talking about statutory services. And I think, again, coming back to the voluntary sector, it's one of the areas that we do very well, because there isn't, it has a different style. But I think the other part of it is what has focused on the family has been troubled families, and yet looking at those relationships, we do feel we're meddling. We do, and how do we do that? Which is sensitive, and I think the key thing always is that those people want it. And when do they want it? Well, one of the ways we find they want it is in our parents' helpline. When parents are desperate, parents want help, and often focused around their child. So there we have an opportunity to actually explore that relationship and what's happening at home. And so it's in those situations, I think, where the door is open to crack. I can only agree that government is not joined up. What can we do? And the idea of lobbying to have a minister to do joined up work, yeah, it's a good one to try, but no. Hey, it's government and it's very big. So
Laura, we'll come back to you in a moment. Let's take some more questions and then I'll come to you first. So we've got some hands up here. I think you were the first. So one here, roving mic at the front. Here. And we've got some other hands. If you show your hands, you're nice and there's quite a few back there. So, okay, and that will be a second one there, and then we'll come to the middle here. Okay, in this order. So please.
It's a bit of a comment, but I think it's very appropriate, the point that was made about calling for a dedicated Secretary of State. I'm just trying to get your attention.
Could you just introduce yourself, please?
So, yeah, I'm Samantha Callan. I work with Lord Farmer in the House of Lords, and slightly more tangentially with Claire, but in a very collaborative way, as often happens in the Lords. So about 60 Conservative MPs and several peers have produced something called the Manifesto to Strengthen Families. Now, the headline, the main recommendation, the Go to the Hill recommendation, is exactly what you said. Not because you've just, well, this is so important, we've got to have it in some kind of iconic way, but because harsh experience has taught us, when we go and see more junior ministers, they say, we'd love to kind of get everyone to work together, but we can't because we're going to step on.
So do you have a question for the panel?
Well, as I said, this is an audience that has contributions to make to this discussion. So that's the spirit in which I'm making it. And I said at the beginning that I'm making a comment. So there's a proverb that says, "Call for the rain in the time of the rain." And I would say, do ask for this right now. Write to Theresa May. We've been writing to her. There's a government review happening right now on the structure of government as a result of this call. So I would say to people in this audience, make it clear that the sector wants this. It's not just parliamentarians. And this is something that you can ask for with some confidence right now. So I'm sorry not to ask a really easy question, but it's quite important that people know where to put effort.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And at the back?
Hi, I'm Eden Birmingham, and I'm currently representing young people in Cornwall. I am soon to be working alongside Barnardo's. Young Minds in Barnardo's is a fantastic opportunity, it gives fantastic opportunities to young people. We've established that funding is already a massive dilemma considering recent cuts to budgets for children's mental health services, especially in Cornwall. What are your plans to overcome or adjust to this crisis within the children's mental health sector, and where should the money be targeted?
Thank you. And you've got the mic here. No, not the one in front. You'll get a chance in a minute.
Thank you. Hi, Usma Piran. I currently work for Stroke Association, but I've got experience working in child protection, NSPCC, and Quorum. And my question to the panel is how you address kind of external pressures on the child. I'm thinking outside the family. My master's dissertation focused on Muslim children who are feeling anxious and worried about the portrayal of Islam in the media and how that's impacting on them. So I just wondered what your recommendations and thoughts were on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And let's take the one behind there.
Hi there, my name is Sam Butters. I'm the director of the Fair Education Alliance, which is a coalition of charities, business and educators trying to tackle educational disadvantage. Really welcome the kind of direct link you've made with the issues discussed today in academic attainment. And my question is around the importance of the role of schools in this and teachers, but I guess with two context pieces in mind. One is that our current kind of accountability systems around schools are very much driven towards academic attainment as the priority thing. And second of all, that those accountability systems are causing stress and high workload for teachers. And I guess given that, how do we shift the mindset to acknowledge that we're only going to reach that academic attainment if we measure and value mental health and well-being and social and emotional skills without adding another stick to kind of beat teachers with, hold them to account and add more stress and workload that would hence kind of make the problem even worse on multiple levels.
Okay, thank you. So questions around funding for stretched services in places of great need, the question around academic attainment and the relationship with mental health and well-being, and not creating yet another stick to beat teachers up with. Laura, do you want to start?
Certainly. I think there's something quite fundamental here about awareness raising and about the language that we're using. I think, as Gordon has said, we have known about the evidence for ACEs for quite some time, but the language that we're now using is different. And for me, there's something empowering for people in understanding that language. So if we can raise awareness of the impact that adversity has on children and young people, and we raise that awareness across society, so this is not just about professional language, it's not about professionals owning that language and doing something to families. We know that ACEs affect all of us. When you look at groups of staff working in caring professions, we will have higher ACE scores than the general public. So ACEs go right across society, and it's something that belongs to all of us. And I think there's something really empowering when we start to understand the impact of ACEs and the impact that trauma has on children and young people. And I think what it then does is wherever you are in systems round about children, it makes you examine your own system, it makes you examine your own practice. And what we've seen with some of the movements across Wales and across Scotland and the progress that's being made around taking this ACE agenda forward is that putting that knowledge into the hands of everybody means that there is a groundswell of movement as to what we can do to actually make things different. So midwives begin to look at, well, what does this mean for my practice? Teachers begin to look at, well, what do we need to do within education to be trauma-informed? What do we need to do to support children and young people? So it shifts from being something that we are saying people need to do things differently to an energy where groups of people begin to come together and say, how can we, within our own remit, with our own framework, do things differently to make things better. So something really important around awareness raising and empowerment, which also I think includes families and includes public in this agenda. So that it is looking at what is it that communities would do. So it's not just about us from a professional perspective. And I think what that then begins to do is you get the progress from government, because governments start to listen, plus you also get the groundswell of and so what is it we will actually do in practice. And if we can bring those two together to capture the good practice and the evidence base that's emerging, we'll move the agenda forward quicker. And I think that also taps into the question about resources that was asked from the young person from Cornwall as to where that money should be targeted. So if we are starting to see an evidence base emerging from services who are testing different pieces of work, then you will begin to discover what's working and what's not working, and what's working for the families and the young people that we actually are working with, rather than it being professionals deciding this is what we think you need to have happening.
Okay. Sarah?
I'll try and be quick. So, young people, absolutely. We are very lucky in some ways in children and young people's mental health, in that we have actually had new money come into us, which is pretty unique in this kind of austerity era that we're living through. And the Green Paper is promising a bit more, not much more, 250 million. But actually what's happening, and what the Young Minds Freedom of Information question has found, is that money doesn't always reach the front line. And so the way that we have found is most successful is that when there is local activism, and that young people are some of the most successful at influencing locally. And you will find that there is a requirement on the CCG and on the CAM service to involve young people in the design of their local services, and get involved in the development of that local strategy, because that is the best way, is on a local basis to actually maximise what funding goes into in children and young people's mental health services, and the style, the way it is done. Some areas have massively invested, other areas have disinvested. It is a completely patchwork quilt across the country. So please get involved, find out locally where to do it, and get other young people to join you, because you can actually have an influence and an impact. So that would be my call to action on that one. And just in terms of the schools question, you're completely right, everything you've said, indeed. Baroness Tyler chaired a commission that with ourselves and the Children and Young People's Mental Health Coalition and Royal College of Psychiatrists. And one of the things I was particularly struck by, some of the evidence that we heard, was a head teacher saying she risked her own reputation because she knew that focusing on well-being and resilience was critical to turning her school around. She came into a school under measures, and she had no support from the local authority, no support from the DFE, but she did it anyway because it was so essential. Schools are doing this, but it is about them having some accolade for what they do and encouragement. What we're very pleased about, and indeed we have had a campaign Wise Up where somebody else from Barnardo has been, was a key part of that. And I do think there has been a groundswell about this from teachers and teachers' unions too. And indeed the Green Paper is going some way to if not address it, at least recognise the important role that schools have. And if you have stressed teachers, it's going to be difficult for them to be being positive and building the resilience of their pupils. So we have to look at their experience as well. So I think that, again, there is recognition that this is critical. There is recognition that we have to look after schools and we have to support them somehow. And we are getting some grains coming our way around this, but there is a long way still to go.
So, Gordon, would you add any further advice to clapped out, burnt out teachers who are suicidal because of the bureaucracy themselves? What would you say to them?
I think the continued framing of intervention around schools as schools being focused on youth mental health, including the huge investment going through from place to be, etc. I don't mean this critically, I'm just going to make it by way of observation. In framing your question, you mentioned social emotional development and various factors relevant to how children do well or behave well and perform well in school. You never mentioned family process. Just implicitly, I would ask the room to reflect on that. The one thing a child takes to school every day is family experience. It is going to require a rebooting of thinking and process and practice to join those two domains up. They are joined up in reality. It is possible for teachers, not all teachers, but designated teachers, to work in the space of identifying exposure events at home that map onto school outcomes, and with the right type of resource and program alignment to do something about it. But it requires a fundamental shift in the recognition. Family factors map onto school outcomes. The evidence is unequivocal.
Thank you. And if I can just add on the teaching question, as a former teacher myself, I taught frontline for over 15 years and then managed teaching services. There's no doubt in my mind that really good teachers know that they're not teaching a class, they're teaching a group of individuals, and individuals need understanding. They need to understand the total child. You know, every child matters. I know nobody talks about that anymore, but there's a message in that, isn't there? And they also know that the average child only spends 20% of their time in class. 80% is the rest of their life. And that's the stuff you're talking about. And there's no way you can make that 20% effective if you don't understand what's going on in the other 80. Other questions? I know there were some other hands. We can take one more round. If you just show your hands and then I can choose. So we've got one question here. I think there was a gentleman back there in the red checked shirt as well, and then one behind. So we take those three questions, please.
Raj Patel, the UK Household Longitudinal Study. Can I try a different line of thinking? I mean, to a certain extent, I guess because we are a household study, we're kind of pondering on some of these questions and looking at policy and infrastructure. And I wanted to pick up the question of infrastructure, and I'll say what I mean by that. One school of thinking could be that post-war we created a public services infrastructure that's largely been driven by health service, schools, and I guess housing, because there was a big drive towards building housing, right? That's not the same thing as saying there's a family infrastructure out there. You could argue there's a whole bunch of charities working together with local authorities, but the closest we've come to creating an infrastructure where I guess people feel they own, it's part of their community, was the Sure Start centers, I guess, to a certain extent. And I'm wondering whether the real long-term game is to recognize that actually the post-war infrastructure we've created doesn't quite work in this modern era where there are loads of things affecting families, and that we maybe do need short-term programs and short-term interventions to a certain extent, but the really long-term game is where is the kind of infrastructure that the family needs, I guess, to a certain extent, which is non-judgmental in a sense. I guess most of us will pop into a GP surgery without thinking that I've got a particular problem and I'm stigmatized. What's the equivalent for families?
Thank you. Just there.
Liam Burns from the Scout Association. It's a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. There was a recent study done by colleagues at Edinburgh University that over a 50-year period through a cohort study showed that scouting and guiding led to a 15% reduction in low-level mental health issues in later life, and that was controlled for socio-economic background as well. Wasn't our research, we were excited to hear it, and ever since then we've been trying to talk to policymakers about the role of volunteer-led models that can be extremely cheap and have huge reach across the UK, backed up with this now quite hard evidence that it can make a positive impact and outcomes for young people. No one's really believed us. So in all these discussions, our model hasn't been seen as a serious policy solution or intervention and something worth investing in. I think my question is kind of reflecting on what I think was your rallying call, Professor, around getting at the top of the cascade, early intervention, and dealing with some of those transition periods in young people's lives. Is models like ours and other programmes like it a serious policy solution? I'm kind of hoping the answer to that is yes. And if it is, then how do we create a climate where that's taken more seriously both by funders and policymakers?
Thank you. And just behind you, the young person.
Hello, I'm Destiny. I'm from Weston-super-Mare. But I just have a quick question for you. Could there be anything in place on like the local radio or TV or the paper or something to help people and parents understand mental health and the support and how to support their children in the right way?
Yep. Okay. So, question around how to best use the media, the climate for change around the Edinburgh model, which I won't give another plug to, but you might want to. It's very good work, though. And then the question from Raj at the front around the bigger infrastructure challenges that families need. Gordon.
So, Raj, if I try to answer this question briefly, I'm happy to discuss it further. So you make a very important point. If I was to strip it down to what are the two, if you like, policy targets over the last 50, 60, 70 years, marital status and the mother-child relationship. If you unpack that to the inter-adult relationship, the mother-child, the father-child, the co-parenting relationships, you're into a more dimensional space. The vast majority of intervention money has gone towards those two domains. Divorce, the mother-child parenting intervention industry. Evidence is robust. Targeting mother-child parenting-focused processes in the context of disrupted adult relationships, wider chaotic family life, does not lead to sustained outcomes. And I'm quite happy to say that live and on air, and I can back it up with evidence. So shifting away from binary measurement of family targets is absolutely a must if we're going to deal with serious level intervention. The question about youth groups, my own declaration of interest here. I was a member of the Boys Brigade from the age of 7 to the age of 21. It's certainly added in complement to my wider community, and your question about wider factors such as social media, etc. No question, it added value to my own individual experience. And I can also say that I had friends who without question benefited from the environment created by that youth group, and indeed promoted resilience among youth who I now know, I'm from Dublin, I'm from Ireland, you can take out of that what you need, who I now know had serious adverse child experiences I didn't know at the time, who are doing well. So actually, these are all part of a bigger picture. I'm aware of the Edinburgh evidence, and I endorse the Edinburgh evidence. So this is part of a wider solution. It's by no means causal, but it's certainly complementary. And last but not least, the question about raising awareness in media. Javed here, I complimented earlier on, saying I really enjoyed your article in it was The Guardian. I read it on the Week Observer, and it was also in The Guardian, because I read it in The Guardian. And Javed said, oh, it wasn't my article, it was written by The Guardian journalist. I had an article recently, a BBC published on, specific to this topic I represented. And I actually wrote to the journalist and thank you very much for being accurate to the evidence that I presented to you. So very important to understand when it comes to engagement with media, what you put in doesn't necessarily mean what comes out. So part of the challenge is to keep the message true. And we're certainly working hard in that space. Thank you for an excellent question.
Thank you. Sarah.
Very briefly about information and awareness and the media. Hopefully, the Young Minds website would be useful to you. That is our very purpose and what we've put a lot of attention into doing. And I know that we have masses of very good feedback from parents and young people about the information. So do take a look. In terms of the media, similarly, I would say a story when I first started at Young Minds, I had a media and press person that I had employed who was very experienced and had worked in all sorts of difficult areas, issues. And 6 months after working with us, came to me and said, because it seemed to me that what we had to do was raise awareness, in particular about the taboo around mental health. And she said to me, Sarah, I don't know I can do this job. I've spoken to all of my contacts in both the written press and TV, and nobody's interested. And we work so hard to get people to hear us and listen to us and talk about it. And I think it isn't just Young Minds by any means. It's a whole sector of people who've worked very hard over the last 10 years. But we can't believe it now when the amount of media coverage there is around mental health. And I have to say, even things like the Royals doing their bit with Heads Together last year has been phenomenal. I think it's now the question is what we do with it. We've got this awareness. We've really got to walk through that door and do something very concrete, because as we know with all of these things, the spotlight will move off at some point. And so we've got to make the progress now, and I think that's quite a responsibility on us and on all of us to do that. Scouts and Girl Guides, I am a long-term supporter of the impact that Scouts and Girl Guides has on resilience. And indeed, we did the resilience badge with Girl Guides last year. I don't believe they don't take you seriously. I think it's more maybe about don't quite know what to do with that. Because I know I've had ministers say back to me, well, of course, the Scouts and Girl Guides are very impactful, but I don't know that they know where to put that within a policy framework. And that would be my challenge back to you. How can that? Because especially going forward, the NHS is thinking about how do they encourage self-care? How do they encourage all of these ways that we actually help each other and look after each other, because the NHS can't afford to. And so I think it's a leap of imagination about how you can put yourselves within a policy context that ministers and government can do something with. Sorry.
Thank you. Laura, final words?
And I think some of that comes back to that awareness raising about the issues and what the solutions are. So if we raise people's understanding, and there is training around where people are understanding what resilience is and what will build children's resilience, then it gives that context for you to demonstrate what your services are doing that's contributing to that agenda for children and young people. Certainly had some conversations with funders recently where we were looking at within community resources, what could we do, what would we be recommending, and there was quite a clear message coming across that some of the things we wouldn't traditionally look at was actually what we needed to begin to make sure there was robust funding around to sustain children's resilience, because some of what we're talking about here is the buffer that we know that offsets ACEs is having good adults, having adults there that are consistent and being around for children to boost their confidence, their self-esteem, give them opportunities to learn new skills. And some of that's actually what the Scouts and the Girls Brigade or the Brownies or whatever it is does. So it's about how... Sorry? And the Boys Brigade. And the Boys Brigade and the Girl Guides and all of these groups. It's that's part of what you're doing, is you're being there within that ecological model of support for a child.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the question session. I just want to make a few comments now to round up proceedings, and then some refreshments and stuff waiting for you. I mean, I hope you agree. It's been a fantastic opportunity, really, to listen to Gordon and his expertise of his 45 years of research now, and summarised in that brilliant way, as I said earlier. And I mean, it's easy to listen to that, but I think I was just reading the slides as he was speaking, and the weight that is in each of those lines that he summarised there. I mean, there is I'm sure you could write a book under. You probably have written a book under each one. Yes, yes, you can give him a plug if you like. But I think it was a privilege to listen to that. And when we say Gordon is a leading light in the thinking and understanding of adverse childhood experiences, I think after that, you'll appreciate why we all believe that. So thank you, Gordon, for joining us. I mean, I said before you spoke that it was my considered view that child mental health in this country is in crisis. And nothing has changed my mind on that. And I haven't heard anybody disagree with that either. And there are lots of, there's evidence behind why it's in crisis. All those statistics that we talked about earlier, I won't go over it again. But we have a problem. We have a major problem. And the mental health green paper, was out there. We're waiting for the government's formal way forward on that. The proposals at the moment lack serious ambition. I know we've got a chance to influence, and part of this, thought leadership that we're trying to create today is part of that journey on influencing. But we all have a responsibility in that, and I know there are great people sitting in the audience who are in their own way are trying to raise the level of debate, trying to influence the political thinkers that are out there so that they do the right thing. And I would encourage you, indeed urge you, to keep on doing that. None of us can do it alone. Barnardo's has a role to play because it's big and it's ugly and all of that stuff, and we're trying to play our part in that, but we can't do it alone. We need collaborative working, we need partnerships, we need interdependencies across the sector and beyond if we're going to see the step change that vulnerable children and young people and their families desperately, desperately need. And Gordon used a phrase earlier where he said mental health, it's not an isolated box of problems. The genes matter, but the environment matters too. I mean, a beautifully succinct way of putting it. This is the inaugural Barnardo's lecture. We're going to have another one. It's annual. It's our contribution to thought leadership. It isn't just about Barnardo's. You know, if this is something that we believe in, and next year we won't be talking about mental health, hopefully it'll be something else, because this one the government will have listened. But what we're really about, what Barnardo's is trying to do, is bring all of that expertise and some of the clout that we have alongside our partners, is to drive the debate about the really big issues that matter, that we all care about, that we really, really worry about, the things that keep us awake at night. And most importantly, like the child that I met, that 15-year-old girl who tried to end her life because she had given up hope, how do we collectively, as people who have some responsibility and some opportunity, do something about that? So the next time that she comes anywhere near that, she knows there is hope, and there are enough people in this country, there are enough leaders, managers, frontline practitioners, enough services, enough politicians, enough people in the media, the think tanks, and everybody else that cares about that one individual, that girl, and is prepared to do something about it, and will stand up and will be counted. That's the journey that we're trying to take our organization on. That's the journey that we want you to work with us on. And we will be here, and we've been around 152 years. We're not going away. We're going to make life really difficult for the people that have the responsibility to bring that change into society, and we want you to be with us on that journey. If there's things that you think we can help with, do please say. We're all ears. We want to work together. Now, please join me in thanking the members of the panel, Professor Gordon Harrell, of course, for his fantastic contribution, but also Sarah and Laura. Thank you for being with us tonight.